I know you mentioned you're wrapping up the rankings and everything like that. The Wild number 2, only team in the playoff team with the top 5. What stood out to you looking at this overall class? It kind of surprises maybe people that they have this kind of class, considering the picks. They haven't had top 10 ones in a while. Just what stands up to make out of this group, and maybe what kept it from being number 1 in your mind?
Well, I think I've talked a little bit about it with you offline, but I think the big thing that kept them from being number 1 was that Jesper has had a tough year. I think if Wallstedt had continued to progress and had a really solid year in the AHL and had a .915 save percentage and was making stops and keeping them in games and that kind of a thing, I think that could have potentially put them sort of more firmly in the first overall, or in the number 1 slot, if you will. For this year's prospect pool rankings. I still, as you guys both know, if you've followed my work, I'm still a big believer in Wallstedt. I like a lot of what I see in Wallstedt. I do think over the course of the last couple of years, there have emerged at least some question marks about his speed in the net and his mobility. And he's a little bit of a heavier guy, and his fitness and that kind of a thing. I don't think he's the quickest goalie, but outside of the quickness piece of it, and maybe him needing to get into a little bit better shape, Wallstedt's a very, very technically sound goalie. He's got good hands. He covers the lower third of the net with his pads well. He gets up and down in his butterfly fine. He plays sharp angles, really sort of technically high-end goalie in that way. And has always, I used to refer to him as kind of like a robot goalie. Like he was just always in the right spots and just made the saves. And now you've started to see it break down a little bit more when he needs to play quicker and be quicker post to post in the net and on scrambles and that kind of a thing. But I do still think he gets there. I do still think he's going to be a very good NHL goalie. The track record is still really strong, but that was kind of maybe the one thing that's holding them back, because otherwise, with the addition of Jiricek, you've now got 2 of the top young D prospects in the sport, plus Brock Faber, who obviously is nowhere close to being a factor for this list anymore. But Brock Faber is a young core piece of that blue line. Part of it is in terms of them being number 2, is that I'm a huge believer in Zeev. I think Zeev is, and my top by now, my top 100 prospect pool ranking will be out at The Athletic. So I can say that Zeev was number 2 on that list, right behind Ivan Demidov as in terms of the top 100 NHL prospects. So just a big believer in Zeev. I think Zeev's going to be a star in the NHL. I think he's going to take over on that first power play from Brock Faber and be a stud. A guy who plays 25 minutes a night and has 60 points in the NHL in a season kind of thing. Like I do think that's the caliber of player that we're potentially talking about here. I think Jiricek's got a chance to be a really strong piece for them if he can sort out the footwork and the mobility and sort of work on his skating a little bit more. Yurov is a legit player, and the move from wing last season to center for Yurov has sort of really changed his projection for me. Obviously had a brilliant season last year at center in the KHL, has been a little bit less productive this season, but looks like he's going to be a second line center now. And that's a big deal for the Wild. So big believer in Yurov. I like Ohgren. I like Khusnutdinov. Charlie Stramel has taken a step this year after reuniting with Adam Nightingale, his head coach previously from the NTDP, and making the transfer from Wisconsin. I think that's been really important. There's some other guys sort of a little further down, Ryder Ritchie and others, who I think have a chance. But that's the core of their group. I still think Riley Height's got a real good opportunity to be a solid NHL player and a power play 2 guy and that kind of a thing. So a lot to like about their pool, but it starts with Zeev and Jiricek and Yurov, and maybe Wallstedt if he can sort of reestablish himself. I know Iowa isn't a strong team defensively in front of Wallstedt, so I think the numbers are at least partly to do with that. But they weren't a great team in front of him defensively last year in Iowa either, and he was better last year than he's been this year. So Wallstedt's kind of the X factor of the group, but I really like Yurov and Zeev and Jiricek, and then obviously they've already got Ohgren and Khusnutdinov playing in the NHL and sort of finding their way as well.
Nice. And you mentioned before, like, very thorough process where you kind of want to check yourself before you post anything. When you went to the Wild and others, like, were there any that they had to check you on? Like, were there any big changes you made at the end?
No, not on the Wild pool. I went to the Wild about this last week and sort of no comments back from them, honestly, about this list in terms of the 1 to 15. I also asked them about some of the guys that I'd left off. So Ryan O'Rourke wasn't on the list. Jack Pert wasn't on the list. Caden Bankier wasn't on the list. Callum Parker wasn't on the list. Rasmus Kumpalainen, who signed, wasn't on the list. Sebastian Soini, who they took in the 4th round in last year's draft and is a top player in the Finnish age group that he's a part of, wasn't on the list. So I sort of sanity checked all of that past them. Aaron Pionk was sort of the last guy on my list. So I sort of asked them, would you have Bankier over Pionk and that kind of a thing? And the answer was that I sort of had it in the right spot. So Bankier was the one who was kind of that, if the list went to 16, I think Bankier, Caden would have been the next player. I've got time for Kumpalainen, but he's really slow, and I've never been able to wrap my head around that. Very well-rounded center. He's got size, but he's really, really slow. So Kumpalainen, I think if he can work on the footwork and the pace of his game, could be a 4th-line center in the NHL potentially someday, in which case he belongs on the list, but I'm just not sold on him getting there and getting sort of into better shape and getting a little bit quicker. And then O'Rourke is another one that just feels, at this point, I think Ryan O'Rourke's probably tops out as a number 8, number 9 defenseman. Like, he's probably more of just a call-up guy rather than an everyday guy.
What do you think of Bankier overall? I know you mentioned number 16, but is he a guy, like, what do you think about his game, and do you think he can play bottom of 6 NHL minutes?
Yeah, I think he's got a chance to. I had a lot of time for him when he was in the WHL. He obviously was a surprise inclusion on the Canadian World Junior team a couple of years ago and had a really nice run there where he became a 90-point guy in the WHL, and he got signed and he played for Canada at the World Juniors, and he just seemed to be on a really strong path. He hasn't been able to make the same kind of impact at the AHL level as he did at the junior level. He's never been the strongest skater. It's something I've talked with him about over the years and something that I think he's aware that he needs to work on. He's also, despite being a fairly tall kid, isn't the biggest or strongest kid. So he doesn't kind of fit that natural checker role, but he hasn't scored enough in the AHL to get promoted as kind of a power play 2 guy or a middle 6 guy. And so I think he's kind of caught in that little bit of an in-between, but he's a well-rounded player. He can play all 3 forward positions. Coaches have always seemed to trust him. He does have some scoring, like he's got a good shot and he's got some skill. I think the question with Bankier has always just been, what is he in the NHL? Like, can he be a 3rd-line guy? And is a coach going to want him as the kind of player that they fit onto a 4th line? He's not really that sort of physical, overpowering forechecking type, but he's also not maybe a skill guy. And so he kind of always fit into that in between. Could he play at 5-on-5 in the NHL in a game tomorrow and hold his own? I think absolutely. But I do wonder whether he just kind of becomes a 13th, 14th, 15th forward kind of thing.
Okay. And there's a couple guys on here that I think Wild fans will be very pleasantly surprised with. Some still just don't know what to make of Jiricek. So him up at 3 is awesome. Charlie Stramel, obviously resurgent year. Aaron Pionk, especially on the back half of, since the holidays, he's looked awesome. The one guy that I see on here that I feel like fans are either going to push back on or be worried that they've fallen off. What can you tell us about Hunter Haight? Is this more indicative of other players rising, or has he shown you things this year that make you hesitant?
No, I actually think Hunter's had a really solid first season at the pro level in the AHL. He's been a very respectable player for them. He spent time on both of their special teams. He's played at center and stuck around at center. I think Hunter's had a solid season. I actually think what downgraded Hunter for me was actually last year. I had a conversation with Height entering last season and the staff in Saginaw, and their goal for him entering last season in the OHL was for him to be a 100-point player in that league. And he finished as a 60-something point player in that league. Now, they were very deep. They went out and acquired Owen Beck at the deadline. They had Matthias Sapovaliv down the middle. They had 3 of the top centers in the OHL last year. And so it became a little bit harder for Height to be the guy and to be the number 1 power play guy and to hit that 90 to 100 point range in his final season in the OHL. He was still a very good player for them. He was an important part of a team that won the Memorial Cup for them. There's a lot to like about Height and the junior career that he ended up having, especially after the trade to Saginaw, which sort of rejuvenated him after he had a very tough time post-draft in Barrie, sort of trying to take a step. The challenge with Height is skates well, good skill, smart player, well-rounded player, but he's a 5'8" 5'10.5", 5'11" center, and the skill has never popped. Like he's never been a top offensive player in his age group or a really sort of star offensive player at any level he's played at. And so what is he as a 5'10.5", 5'11" center if all of his tools are good but not great? I've got a lot of time for him. Everybody who's ever coached him has had a lot of time for him. I know the Minnesota Wild have a lot of time for him, but I think ultimately it's going to be hard for him to carve out a niche as a full-time NHLer. Will Hunter Height play games in the NHL? I think he will. Is he going to be an 82-game player, or is he the kind of guy who plays 30 games for you a year and then is in the AHL the rest of the time kind of thing? I think that's what they have to figure out. And it's going to be challenging for him with Khusnutdinov and some of the other young players that they're also trying to incorporate. And once Yurov comes over, there's another roster spot, another guy who's ahead of Hunter Height on the totem pole. It might be a little tricky for him to earn minutes with them at the NHL level, I think.
And as you follow the Wild for a long time, you've noticed that the center position has been an intriguing and frustrating one for them for their whole existence, basically. And I still wonder if they do have a true number one center on their roster right now. Like,
yep.
Rossi's been great the last couple of years. He's really done everything they've asked him to do. Eric Sinek, obviously a valuable two-way player. That's where Yurov to me comes in. And I know you mentioned probably a second line center in the NHL. Maybe their number one center comes from free agency with all the money they're going to have. But where do you see that dynamic?
Maybe you can win with 3 second line centers, right? Like maybe that's the path for them.
No, very much too. Like, you just think of other guys in their division, like McKinnon, and you look in the West with McDavid, and everybody has that guy that, playoff time, right? Who's going to match up other than the blue line, which will be great. But so you see Yurov logically probably is more of like a second line guy, second line center, versus being like the alpha number one kind of thing eventually.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of Yurov is that he played left wing and right wing all the way up. So maybe he's a second line center or a first line winger, right? Like maybe he makes the move back to the wing, even though his best hockey, I believe, has been played at the best hockey of his career has been in the last 2 years, and especially last year. And he played it entirely at center. So I do think center really works for Yurov. He's an incredibly smart player. He understands where to be on the ice and how to use time and space to his advantage. He can play with a variety of line mates. But the beauty of Yurov is that maybe he is that guy like Leon Draisaitl's is an entirely different monster, but Leon has often played on the first line wing with Connor McDavid when they've needed to. And then he's been their second line center at other times. And he's been their first line center. And they've kind of had 2 first line centers in Ottawa. Very different situation here, but maybe Yurov can elevate and play on your first line on the wing when you need him to. And then he can be a second line center type when you need him to. Maybe he gets to first line center status. I do think that would be a bit of a surprising outcome. Like, I think he's more likely a second line center than a first line center. I think he's more likely a 50 to 60 point player than a 70, 80 point player. But would it be completely out of the question for him to have a season like that at some point in his career? Could he be a 50 point guy every year and then have a season or two where he's a 70 point guy with the right line mates? I think that's possible for Danila. I think he's going to be a heck of a player and surprise some people. And I think had they been a part of the World Juniors over the last few years, and had we been able to see more of him internationally in a best on best setting, I think there would be a lot more excitement in North America about who Danila Yurov is as a prospect.
Very fair. Joe, do you have anything else, or did we want to wrap on the final question?
I was going to ask about Khusnutdinov, because he's on your list. Obviously, he's an NHL player, could probably be on or off it. And I'm sure you don't watch them every day, but the last 4 or 5, 6 games, he's really started to come on and like be a little more of a force, like, aggressive, offensively, physical. And I think I agree with you in your write up, where there are times I thought he could be in Iowa and it could benefit him. Right. Yep. I don't know if that's actually going to happen or not, but where do you see him as a player, and like, is this kind of what his role probably will be in the NHL as far as like 4th line, 3rd line center, or is there more upside there than? I know fans are always like, you should move him up. I'm like, well, there's other guys ahead of him, and like maybe he fits better because he's playing that role minutes.
I think ideally he becomes a really productive 40-point 3rd line center. I don't think he's a 4th line center long term. I think he's more talented than that. I think he's smarter than that. The work ethic has always been there. He's always sort of earned the trust of his coaches. He plays hard. He's a smart player. I don't think the skill is high end. Like, I don't think you'll ever see him on PP1 kind of thing. But could he become a PP2 guy who contributes regularly at 5-on-5 and is an important part of a winning team? Absolutely. Could he become a $3.5-4 million player in the NHL who's a solid third line center? Absolutely. So I think that's what you have to be working towards and building towards with Marat, is sort of elevating him eventually at the right time, elevating him from sort of fourth line usage and playing 10 minutes a night to eventually playing 14, 15 and a half minutes a night. I think that's the path for him.
You kind of have Stramel in a third line center role too, right? You have Stramel kind of in that similar, different players, but you have in the similar like slot probably, you know.
Yeah, and if Stramel ends up as a fourth line center, I think that's a good outcome for him as well. Not all of these guys need to be playing high in a lineup for them to be having an impact. If he becomes an excellent fourth line center, even as a first round pick, I think that's a respectable outcome that you can live with. So, and he looks very different than Khusnutdinov. So if that's your 3-4C of the future, they offer something completely different. Stramel's, they call him the big rig. Like, he's just a big boy. He's heavier over pucks. He's got that size and strength to him. Khusnutdinov relies more on his know-how and his smarts and right place, right time and work ethic and that kind of a thing. But I think that could be the solid foundation of something. Now, is that it? Let's say it's Yurov or Rossi and then Khusnutdinov and then Stramel, and that's the future. Is there a path for all of those guys to be a part of the team when they're all going to remain fairly young for the next few years? Are they going to want to spend money elsewhere? Where does Joel Eriksson Ek fit into it? Are they going to spend money in free agency once Suter and Parise fully come off the books? All of those things are things that they're going to grapple with. The cap's going up. There's going to be money to spend. And as a result, not all of those guys are going to play. Riley Height is also a center, we have to remember, right? Like, it's not all of these guys are going to make it, and that's okay. But I think most of them feel like they're on the right path. And obviously in Khusnutdinov and Ohgren's case, they're already starting to contribute.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of guys that can go up this way, but you've been really bullish on Zeev, which I've watched him a lot. I think, that'll be, I don't know if it's him in favor going forward or how they mix that pairings up, but I don't know if he can have the same impact that maybe favored right away. Maybe they're different kind of players. I don't know if you see that. Like, maybe kind of unfair to expect him to come in and be right in the playoffs and then next year be favor.
I try to always temper my expectations and not get carried away. And I try not to fuel the fire with fans, but I truly believe that Zeev's ready to come in and contribute this spring once his season at Denver's over and play in the playoffs and be a good player right away. Now, is he going to play 30 minutes like Brock Faber did as a rookie? Probably not, but no, I can't remember the last time a defenseman other than Brock Faber, and although Lane Hudson has played some pretty ridiculous minutes this year. But even like Aaron Ekblad wasn't playing those minutes. Rasmus Dahlin wasn't playing those minutes. Owen Power did right away play 24, 25 minutes a night in Buffalo. But I could Zeev Buium next year play 20 minutes a night for them and then you've got Faber playing 26, 27 and Zeev slots in immediately on your second pairing and immediately on one of your two power plays. I absolutely think he's capable of being that kind of a player right away.
Fans are going to take that and run.